Hey, thank you very much. I'm very pleased and honored to be back, and I congratulate Coptic Solidarity for carrying the torch through another year and to bring Washington's attention, keep it riveted on the Copts, and congratulations, Chamber I'm going to make 3 points in my talk. One is that ISIS is drawing the battle lines in Egypt, and it's on the Copts. 2, it is counting on these iron rings that Ambassador Fernandez spoke of, the bigotry of the government, and injustice of the government towards the Copts and toward the society at large, to be successful. And 3, the secular myopia of the Western world is missing this. On the morning of May 26th, Mohsen Morkis, a 60-year-old Egyptian-American Christian from the Chicago suburb of Tinley Park, was traveling in a bus with other Coptic Christians and was ambushed by ISIS jihadis. The men and boys were separated from the women. They were forced off the bus. They were commanded to recite the Shahada, and when they refused, they were shot at point-blank range in the head. The attack was a one-day news story here, despite the fact that Morkis was an American citizen. And that is very disturbing. Maybe it's because it occurred in a remote area at St. Samuel the Confessor Monastery in rural Minya, en route to that monastery in rural Minya. Maybe it's because it was overshadowed by the attacks in the UK at the same time, around the same time, a few days before, a few days later. Or maybe it's because the West has just begun to find it mundane, a commonplace event in Egypt, and has lost interest. That would be a terrible mistake. It would be a terrible mistake to overlook the slaughter of these pilgrims, because they are the latest atrocity in a blood-soaked pattern that is in which the Coptic Christians have become ISIS's favorite prey. It sheds light on the ideology symbolized by the black flag, which a year before his murderous London Bridge attack, Khurram Bot had proudly displayed allegiance to, in a scene that was aired by British television to millions of uncomprehending Western viewers and intelligence officials. Nor should we miss how such attacks impact our own national interests in the region. The Copts, as you know, are the largest Christian minority in the region. They're also the largest non-Muslim religious minority of any kind in the region, at 9 million, more than the Jews in Israel or the Christians in Lebanon. So if the Copts are forced out or driven out, if ISIS pursues their genocide as they have with the Iraqi and Syrian Christians, this region, which was pluralistic, cultural mosaic, will be dramatically transformed, and to the detriment of our national interests. Now, it was Copts who became the icon of ISIS genocide against Middle Eastern Christians 2 years ago with the release of a graphic video by ISIS of the 21 members of the community being ritually beheaded on a Libyan beach, lined up, forced to kneel to their knees, and just before their throats were slit by the jihadis, clad in black, the ISIS captives could be heard whispering in the audio, the Our Father, apparently an ISIS editorial slip-up. And their relatives whom I recently met, hailed them as heroes for refusing to recite the Shahada and dying with a Christian prayer on their lips. Across the rooftop of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, where I visited not too long ago, of course, the site of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, most revered church in Christendom, the Coptic Orthodox Church has strung up a large banner that bears a still from this ISIS video of their martyrs, of their precious martyrs. And as Bishop Makarios, the top Orthodox cleric in Minya, said about Marcos and the other pilgrims on television last month, quote, "They chose death. We take pride to die while holding on to our faith." So it wasn't until a year and a half later, when the Islamic State began losing ground in its caliphate, that ISIS returned its sights to the Copts, this time in the homeland. On December 11th, 2016, it bombed a church within the Orthodox compound in Cairo, killing 25 of the faithful. And then 2 months later, it announced its formation in a video which specifically addressed the Copts, showing footage of the December 11th carnage. A voiceover says, "You are a target at the top of our priorities, our favorite prey," directly speaking to the Copts. And the explanation given is a bigoted mix of religion and politics. So the Copts are among the crusaders who fight the Muslims, and they supported Egyptian President Sisi, who bombed the mosques and renovated churches. And the West has made much of the Western analysis says that the purpose of this is to target, and targeting the Christians is tactical to divide Egypt. And that's true. But it also serves ISIS' principal religious goal. The video stresses that the Copts stand in the way of a Sharia state. And it selects as its authority one of the most militant passages in the Quran about killing the polytheists whenever you find him, and to ambush them everywhere. That's in the video. So the ensuing persecution, as you know, has been scorching. In March, 8 Copts in northern Sinai were brutally assassinated, which triggered then a mass exodus of hundreds more from the region. Palm Sunday, 2 Coptic church services were blown up by suicide bombers and killing 45 Copts. And then April 18th, there was an attack against the ancient St. Catherine's Monastery where a police guard was killed. And then in May, hours before Ramadan began, ISIS laid in wait on the dirt road in Minya to massacre pilgrims heading to the monastery. So that these attacks are hitting the community hard. Their aftermath, unlike in the West, is not comforting shrines of teddy bears and candles, erected by strangers for diverse, scattered victims. It's marked by long funeral processions with dozens of caskets carried to the same church at the same time, followed by entire congregations shrieking in grief. And as my Hudson colleague and Egyptian analyst Samuel Tadros has observed, many Copts, including an entire village, are now desperate to immigrate abroad, and their efforts seem to intensify with each passing attack. And as you well know, the Copts are not crusaders. They were not crusaders. They are not foreign to Egypt. I won't go into the fact that they predated Islam in the region, in the country. But suffice to say that, nonetheless, ISIS's Egypt franchise, led by local extremists, aims to attract the country's Sunni population, not by playing up economic grievances, not by focusing on Israel, but by targeting the Copts as a fifth column of infidels within their midst. And I think this could play well in Egypt. Egypt's official institutions have long demonized and repressed them, and it's not surprising that many of the country's majority view them as threatening outsiders. Once an angry mob plundered and burned a Coptic village church after finding it in an ancient Coptic liturgical script, which was so foreign and unfamiliar they mistook it for a sign of sorcery. A few years ago, I invited a prominent Coptic Orthodox bishop to Washington to lecture on Coptic cultural origins. The Egyptian state-controlled media falsely accused him of plotting to replace Arabic with the long-dead Coptic language as Egypt's official language, and published a historical barrage of 200 death threats against him, delaying his return home. And so while the Copts are supposed to be equal citizens under law, they are de facto treated as dhimmis in many cases. And there is widespread disparagement and discrimination against them in the administration of justice, as we just heard, in important government jobs, official textbooks, state-controlled media, and government-supported mosques. And this, in turn, incites the cultural violence against them. The slightest rumor of a Coptic involvement with a Muslim woman or perceived disrespect for Islam can ignite the match that tortures an entire Coptic neighborhood. An example occurred last year, involved Coptic school kids who taped a 30-second video on their cell phone of themselves mocking ISIS. After angry mobs rioted at their homes, they and their teacher were arrested and sentenced up to 5 years in prison for blasphemy. And the state continues to enforce laws influenced by the Ottoman era that restrict the building and repair of churches. In recent decades, most of the pogroms seem to involve church attacks incited by this. The persecution ratcheted upward during the Arab Spring Revolution when in 2011, 2 years before the formation of ISIS, a church service in Alexandria on New Year's was bombed, killing 21. After the 2013 military overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood government, mobs scapegoated the Copts and destroyed scores of their ancient churches. Security forces sometimes become the tormentors. Police have been known to shoot down Coptic monks and their helpers from monastery roofs as they made repairs. Security forces have used their tanks to run over Copts peacefully protesting church burnings. In 2013, police officers joined a mob and threw tear gas and rocks at St. Mark's Cathedral in Cairo. Even after President Sisi, who has spoken strongly in defense of the Copts, such incidents typically occur with impunity, with Copts forced to so-called reconciliation sessions that end in a handshake rather than legal justice. So as I said, most of these events seem to be focusing on the churches, and this is now what ISIS has picked up on. And ISIS is raising the stakes. Its strategy in a country that is already primed to curb Christian worship is to show that it will eradicate the entire Coptic presence. ISIS is taking planes not to harm Muslims in the process in Egypt, undertaking surgical strikes at the churches and even issuing a warning for them to stay away from Christian gathering places. A Pew poll from March, Pew Research Center poll from March indicates that 74% of Egyptian Muslims want Sharia governance. How many would support ISIS version is unknown. But in October 2014, a poll by the Washington Office for Near East Policy reveals that shortly after ISIS established its caliphate, ISIS had the approval of 3% of Egyptians, a small fraction, but one that represents 1.5 million adults. In late 2014, Samuel Tadros mapped dozens of Egypt's Salafi movements and leading voices, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's head, who share ISIS's malignant views. So counterterrorism is critical, but even if it's carried out expertly, which it's not in Egypt, it alone cannot staunch ISIS's inroads. In a show of solidarity with the beleaguered Copts, Pope Francis went to Egypt's Sunni Center for Learning, Al-Azhar, for an interfaith dialogue in April. He gave an impassioned plea for educational reform in Egypt that, quote, corresponds to the nature of man as an open and relational being, and it's based on wisdom. And I encourage you to take a close look at that speech. It's very, very important. President Sisi himself has strenuously denounced extremism and the anti-Coptic attacks, and he has called for a religious revolution. But there should be no confusion. The state of the Copts is now, the fate of the Copts is now the main measure of the effectiveness of his policies against Egypt becoming ISIS's new battleground. And the world needs to be paying